Thoughts and feelings aren't real. That's a topic I want to discuss today. It's day 15 of my 30-day challenge, and I'm going to try and explain myself and what I mean by the phrase thoughts and feelings aren't real. Today's exercise is to explain a concept that I am familiar with and that I know well and break it down into simple terms. The first thing that I thought of when I read that as an exercise was to try and explain Drupal. And because that's what I'm trained in, it's my specialty. It's a web development concept that you may or may not be aware of. Probably not. Most people aren't. And I was going to explain that, and I could, and it would be a good exercise. But I mean, who's really interested in that? I might make its own video at some point. But given the audience I'm aiming at and what I'm trying to achieve with this channel, and move away from the tech as much as possible, so it's always going to come into this situation, and it's part of who I am. And if I'm going to put myself out here, tech and web development is going to come into the mix. But it's not really where my main passions lie. So I've settled on explaining the concept of how thoughts and feelings aren't real. Now, I don't know about you, but the first time I heard that phrase, I was a little bit, what do you mean? What? I don't quite understand. Now, I read it in a book, so the book quickly went on to explain what it's talking about. Now, it's not to be taken perfectly literally, of course, because if you move around in some of the spiritual and new agey circles, you'll come across phrases like thoughts are things. Bit of a magical idea. If you think it, then it can form it into reality. Now, there's some truth to that. I know when you do goal setting, it's a good idea to write it down. And I've often explained that if you have a concept and you write it down, you have made it real. It's a form of manifestation. If I'm thinking about buying a new red car and I write down buy a new red car, already I've transferred that thought from thinking into a realistic, material, real world representation of that thought. And so obviously when you think things and when you feel things, they're a real experience. You really experience having that thought. You really experience having that emotion. But what's meant by the phrase that thoughts and things aren't real is that what they represent aren't real. Now, have you thought about that? That what you think isn't necessarily representing reality. What you're feeling isn't necessarily representing reality. Now, I've spoken to some people who initially balk at this situation, but I find it's very easy to come up with examples where this point is proven beyond a doubt. For example, child scared of the monster under the bed. They feel it. They'll even come and tell you, parents, there's a monster under my bed. Now, is there really a monster under their bed? Absolutely not. It's the fear. And so that's what our minds do. If you understand the concept of an ego, now the ego being, in this discussion of it, the ego being our vehicle of orientation, our ego, the part of us that makes us an individual, the part of us that understands who we are separate to other people, who we are separate to the world, thinking about a newborn baby. Now, we've seen this in science. I'm sure you've heard of, well, I'm not sure. Imagine you've heard the concept, you probably have, of a newborn baby that they don't distinguish themselves from their mother. There's a word for this. Object permanence, I think, is this same concept. So they've done those studies in science when the baby can't see, like they put a ball behind a wall or hide it, they've then are unaware of the ball's existence, because to a little baby, they themselves and the world is everything, right? They don't distinguish any difference. It's either they see it and they experience it and that's real, or it's not. And as we age, we develop this ability to recognize that things are not us and define ourselves as separate to those things. And that, so when I'm speaking about ego, it's that mechanism within ourselves, that bit that can say, I'm me and the ball's the ball and that's separate, and be able to rationalize and understand and comprehend the world in the materialistic, realistic terms. However, that rational mind is fallible. It's the idea that it's really objectively true that just because you think something doesn't mean it's real, and it seems really obvious when you put it this way. And perhaps it is to some people, and perhaps you see it obvious, but there's a lot of people in the world, and I'm guilty of this, and I fall into this trap still now, even with this knowledge and this understanding of the concept. But it's so easy to fall into the trap that if we think it, it must be true. If we feel it, I mean, fear is an obvious example, and, it takes us over. When you're scared of something, go back into my childhood, we used to go out to a place called Bents Basin, which is a huge big water hole along the Nepean River, and quite a common place for people to go and have picnics and spend a day there by the water where you could swim. So freshwater swimming hole. And on the other side of the basin was a rock wall where you could climb up and jump off the rocks. Now, I remember the first time I went to jump off those absolutely being held in fear, the fear that if I jump, something will happen. If I jump, something will go wrong, I'll get hurt, I'll die. But is that real, and is that true? Is it true that if I jump off those rocks into the water that I'll die? See, and it's not. And so it's a really good explanation of how that thought of I'll probably smash on the rocks or something will go wrong, or like my mother told me this is dangerous, that something could go wrong. And then actually taking that leap and jumping into the water to find out that I landed perfectly in the water and it was exhilarating and it was fun. So it's a really good example of how my thoughts aren't real, right? I had the thoughts, I had the fears, I was experiencing that as though it's real. But what thoughts and feelings do is they represent our subconscious, well, not subconscious, they represent our unconscious assumptions about what will happen. And that's why this is such an interesting concept to start to understand, because it starts to help you really learn to understand yourself and where you come from, because your thoughts and feelings point to your unconscious biases. And learning to make that separation between my ego and me, and realizing that's the difference, that the part of you that perceives those thoughts, the part of you that can look in your head and observe that you are thinking, or look in your head and observe that you are feeling something, and then separate yourself from that. Two different people. So this understanding that thoughts and feelings aren't real, I think, is an amazing piece of wisdom that I'd love to share with you. And hopefully I've been able to explain that in a very concise, simple and straightforward manner. If you've got any questions, come and ask me. I'd love to hear what you've got to say about it. I'm just checking the time. I didn't start the timer. I set up a new timer on my pad. I got my pad here. I have been using the timer in Google before. It just occurred to me that I'm a silly fool and there's a timer in this, and I brought the timer up but didn't press start. And getting used to this, been doing these talks every day for this day 15 today. And so, because I didn't get a feel for, I think I'm around the 5-minute mark, probably a little bit over at this point. I don't know. I'm going to measure it. I don't want to keep talking for 10 minutes. I'm finding these are a little bit long, I think, for the content. So I'm going to wrap it up here, and I'll see you tomorrow. Ciao.